This is the Biblical Unitarian Podcast.
Hello, and welcome to the Biblical Unitarian Podcast, the podcast that aims to start conversations about the oneness and unity of God and about the humanity of Jesus. My name is Dustin Smith, and as always, I will be your host. This week we have episode 356 entitled Jesus as the New Jeremiah in Matthew's Gospel. So this week's episode is going to explore the emphasis that the Gospel of Matthew gives to the person of Jeremiah. And we're going to be asking whether there is any relevance to the Christological portrayal of Jesus with the comparison with this famous 6th century BC prophet. So, why is it that the crowds regarded Jesus as a prophet like Jeremiah in Matthew's Gospel? Let's find out on this week's episode of the Biblical Unitarian Podcast. Our first point today is looking at preliminary clues that Matthew is portraying Jesus as the new Jeremiah. So you can do a word study on the proper noun Jeremiah in the pages of the New Testament, and you will find that the name Jeremiah appears only 3 times. But guess what? All 3 of those occurrences are in the Gospel of Matthew. I think that's interesting. And the particular passage in Matthew that got me to think about this particular question is the passage in which Jesus asked the disciples, "Who do you say that I am?" So here in Matthew chapter 16, starting in verse 13, it says that when Jesus came into the district of Caesarea Philippi, he was asking his disciples, "Who do people say that the Son of Man is?" And they said, "Some say John the Baptist, and others Elijah, but still others Jeremiah, or one of the prophets." He said to them, "But who do you say that I am?" Simon Peter answered, "You are the Christ, the Son of the living God." That's Matthew 16, verses 13 through 16. Now, why is it that some people, according to Matthew, were saying that the Son of Man is Jeremiah? Most readers never stop to question what Jesus did or what he said to bring about this particular response from the crowds. Nor do we ask the question why Matthew would think that it's important to even include that particular reference. And so I stopped and I asked the question, why is it that they saw Jesus and the things that he was saying and the things that he was doing, and they said, yeah, that guy looks like Jeremiah? Why is it that they came to that conclusion? So I started to think about the typology in the Gospel of Matthew, and I wanted to ask whether maybe Matthew is typologically portraying Jesus as the new Jeremiah. Now, typology is not something that Matthew is a stranger to. Very clearly, John the Baptist functions as the type of Elijah. Scholars have even made comparisons between the famous patriarch Abraham and Jesus, especially because the end of the Gospel of Matthew has the Great Commission, to where Jesus says that you are to make disciples of all the nations. And of course, Abraham was repeatedly promised that he would be the father of many nations. So some people have drawn a connection between Abraham and Jesus. Now, there is no question at all that Jesus functions as the new David, as the son of David, and that he functions typologically in relation to David in the Gospel of Matthew. Very clearly, Jesus also is the new Moses. He goes on the mountain and he gives the new law. Very clearly, Jesus functions as the new Moses. Some people have even made a connection between the prophet Jonah, because even Jesus said that as Jonah was 3 days and 3 nights in the belly of the sea monster, so the Son of Man will be 3 days and 3 nights in the heart of the earth. Both Jonah and Jesus were rescued out of those particular dire predicaments. Now, another overlooked type is the connection between Jesus and Noah, because Jesus himself said that just as were the days of Noah, so too will be the coming of the Son of Man. So Jesus makes a connection with Noah by his own words. So we really shouldn't be surprised if Matthew is portraying Jesus as a type of Jeremiah. If Jesus is the new Abraham, if he's the new David, if he's the new Moses, if he's the new Jonah, if he's the new Noah, why can't Jesus be the new Jeremiah? So I thought, well, let's just look at the places in which Jeremiah actually is mentioned. This will move us to our second point. Point number 2, Matthew's explicit references to Jeremiah. So as I already mentioned, the proper name Jeremiah appears only 3 times, and all 3 of those occurrences are in the Gospel of Matthew. Now, we already read one of them in Matthew chapter 16, which is not an inconsequential passage. It is clearly the passage in which Peter makes the Christological confession that Jesus is the Son of God, Jesus is the Christ. That much is very important. But the 2 other references, I think, are very interesting. The first one is at the beginning of Jesus' ministry, and it indicates that Jesus is, in some sense, fulfilling something that Jeremiah said. So let's look at the context. Matthew chapter 2, starting in verse 16, says, "Then when Herod saw that he had been tricked by the Magi, he became very enraged, and sent and slew all the male children who were in Bethlehem and all its vicinity, from 2 years old and under, according to the time which he had determined from the Magi. Then what had been spoken through Jeremiah the prophet was fulfilled. A voice was heard in Ramah, weeping and great mourning, Rachel weeping for her children, and she refused to be comforted because they were no more." That's Matthew chapter 2, verses 16 through 18. So here we have Jesus being rejected, and Jesus also being persecuted by Jewish persons, even though you might say that Herod is only partially Jewish, but he is a Jewish person in authority with power, and he is rejecting Jesus as the king, as the Messiah. And Jeremiah is being cited in order to make this particular point. Now, the other occurrence, the third occurrence, is in Matthew chapter 27, starting in verse 6. So we have an occurrence at the beginning of Jesus' ministry, and we have an occurrence at the end of Jesus' ministry, and then, of course, we have Matthew chapter 16, verse 14, which is kind of at this climactic height of Jesus' ministry. So let's look at this third passage, Matthew 27, starting in verse 6. "The chief priests took the pieces of silver and said, 'It is not lawful to put them in the temple treasury, since it is the price of blood.' And they conferred together, and with the money bought the potter's field as a burial place for strangers. For this reason, that field has been called the field of blood to this day. Then that which was spoken through Jeremiah the prophet was fulfilled. And they took the 30 pieces of silver, the price of the one whose price had been set by the sons of Israel, and they gave them for the potter's field as the Lord directed me." That's Matthew 27, verses 6 through 10. Again, we have a Jeremiah quotation, just like we saw in Matthew chapter 2, that deals with Jesus being rejected. Now he's actually being rejected by one of his closest followers, by Judas, by one of the 12 apostles. And he's sold for the price of a slave. So there's an interesting theme that we're seeing here, that Jesus is being compared to Jeremiah, and he's fulfilling things that Jeremiah said that all deal with the fact that Jesus is a rejected figure and a persecuted figure, not by Gentiles per se, but by people that would be his own people, by Jewish people, by sons of Israel. Now, this particular quotation, and if you're reading along in your Bible, you will have already noticed this particular point, is very interesting because Matthew explicitly says that this was spoken through Jeremiah. However, the quotation is actually from Zechariah, chapter 11, verse 13. So why is it that Matthew is saying that this is what Jeremiah has said, the prophet, but he actually quotes explicitly from Zechariah? Now, there have been several explanations for this. ranging from one extreme that Matthew has just made a blunderous mistake to the other extreme, which that Matthew is quoting some lost apocryphal saying of Jeremiah that we no longer have access to. How convenient. But I think there's a much more likely reason for this, even if it's a little complex. Perhaps Matthew is thinking of the potter and the burial place that this quotation deals with that actually are mentioned in a Jeremiah passage, namely Jeremiah chapter 19, verse 11. This passage says, "Thus says Yahweh of hosts, just so I will break this people and the city, even as one breaks a potter's vessel, which cannot again be repaired, and they will bury in Topeth, because there is no other place for burial." That's Jeremiah 19, verse 11. So this Jeremiah passage talks about the potter's vessel, and it also talks about a burial place. Both of those themes are connected in the Zechariah chapter 11, verse 13 quote. So perhaps what Matthew is doing is that he sees the quotation in Zechariah, and he sees this as actually blending in and overlapping with the themes of Jeremiah chapter 19, verse 11, particularly dealing with the potter and the burial place. So we have an explicit quotation, but we also have an implicit passage that is being fulfilled. That's my best guess on it. If you have any other options, I'm happy to read about them in the comments section. So there are the three explicit places in which Jesus is connected to the prophet Jeremiah by Matthew. So in some sense, Jesus is portraying Jesus as the new Jeremiah. But I don't think that's all the evidence. And this is going to move me to our third point. Point number 3, Matthew's implicit references to Jeremiah. I think there are several places in the Gospel of Matthew to where Jesus will say certain words and perform certain deeds that if you are familiar with the text of Jeremiah, it appears as if Matthew is making a very deliberate allusion to Jeremiah, a very deliberate echo to the life and teachings of the prophet Jeremiah. Now, my particular argument here is not based on all of these being true. You might actually think that half of them are true, but all it takes is a few of them to be true in order to further clarify the point that Matthew is portraying Jesus as the new Jeremiah, something that Matthew has explicitly stated 3 times already. So let's look at some of the evidence and you can decide for yourself. The first one is in Matthew 21, verse 13, where Jesus said to them, "It is written, my house shall be called a house of prayer, but you are making it a robber's den." Matthew 21:13. So here Jesus has a dual quote, one from Isaiah 56, verse 7, and the second one, where he says that you're making it a robber's den, is from, guess where? Jeremiah, chapter 7, verse 11, where in particular Matthew is quoting the phrase robber's den from the Septuagint explicitly, exactly, verbatim, word for word, without changing a particular letter. So Jeremiah, of course, was preaching against the first temple, Solomon's temple, and Jesus here is preaching against the second temple. And what does he do? He quotes Jeremiah preaching against the temple. I don't think that's an accident. Let's look at another example. A little bit later in the chapter, Matthew 21, starting in verse 18. "Now in the morning, he was returning to the city. He became hungry. Seeing a lone fig tree by the road, he came to it and found nothing on it except leaves only. And he said to it, no longer shall there be any fruit from you. And at once the fig tree withered. Seeing this, the disciples were amazed and asked, how did the fig tree wither all at once? And Jesus answered and said to them, truly I say to you, if you have faith and do not doubt, you will not only do what is done to this fig tree, but even if you say to this mountain, be taken up and cast into the sea, it will happen. That's Matthew 21, verses 18 through 21. So Jesus curses a fig tree. He indicates that there is no fruit, And he is, of course, comparing it to Jerusalem and the inhabitants of Jerusalem and the leadership there in the temple that he just left in the previous passage. And then he tells the disciples that you can say to this mountain, meaning Mount Zion, be taken up and cast into the sea, and it's going to happen, which is another prophetic act of judgment. But Jeremiah has a very similar phrase. In Jeremiah chapter 8, verse 13, Jeremiah says, speaking the words of Yahweh, I will surely snatch them away, declares Yahweh. There will be no grapes on the vine and no figs on the fig tree, and the leaf will wither, and what I have given them will pass away. That's Jeremiah chapter 8, verse 13. So we could see that there's going to be no figs on the fig tree. And what do we see with Jesus? No figs on the fig tree. I don't think that's an accident. Okay, next example. Matthew 21, verse 33. Jesus says, listen to another parable. There was a landowner who planted a vineyard, put a wall around it, and dug a wine press in it, and built a tower, and rented it out to the vine growers, and went on a journey. When the harvest time approached, he sent his slaves to the vine growers to receive his produce. The vine growers took his slaves and beat one and killed another and stoned a third. That's Matthew 21, verses 33 through 35. Now, I think that Jesus, in addition to alluding to Isaiah chapter 5, is also alluding to Jeremiah chapter 12, particularly verses 10 through 11, which says, many shepherds have ruined my vineyard. They have trampled down my field. They have made my pleasant field a desolate wilderness. It has been made a desolation, desolate. It mourns before me. The whole land has been made desolate because no man lays it to heart. Jeremiah chapter 12, verses 10 through 11. So here we can see the vineyard, God's vineyard, referring to his people and, of course, his land, and it's become desolate because the people are not taking care of it. And what do we have with Jesus? He tells a parable, and I think the resonances of the vineyard not being taken care of by the people would have resonated with the listeners, and if they had Jeremiah in mind, they would know, oh, okay, this is sounding as if Jesus is speaking the sort of things that Jeremiah has said in the past concerning God's vineyard. In Matthew chapter 23, verse 37, Jesus says, Jerusalem, Jerusalem, who kills the prophets and stones those who are sent to her. How often I wanted to gather your children together, the way a hen gathers her chicks under her wings, but you were unwilling. That's Matthew 23, verse 37. So here we have the condemnation specifically of Jerusalem because the inhabitants of Jerusalem stone the prophets and kills the prophets. Well, this is the sort of stuff that Jeremiah talked about explicitly. I'll give you a couple examples. In Jeremiah chapter 7, verse 25, Yahweh says, since that day that your fathers came out of the land of Egypt until this day, I have sent you all my servants, the prophets, daily rising early and sending them. Jeremiah chapter 7, verse 25. The whole point is that God continues to send Jerusalem the prophets, but they get rejected. And in one particular example, we know of a particular prophet, according to Jeremiah, who actually does get rejected by the king of Jerusalem. So in Jeremiah 26, verse 20, it says, indeed, there was also a man who prophesied in the name of Yahweh, Uriah, the son of Shemaiah, from Kiriath Jearim, and he prophesied against the city and against this land words similar to all those of Jeremiah. When King Jehoiakim and all his mighty men and all the officials heard his words, then the king sought to put him to death. But Uriah heard it, and he was afraid and fled and went to Egypt. Then King Jehoiakim sent men to Egypt, Elnathan, the son of Achbor, and certain men with him went into Egypt, and they brought Uriah from Egypt and led him to King Jehoiakim, who slew him with the sword and cast his dead body into the burial place of the common people. Jeremiah chapter 26, verses 20 through 23. So Jeremiah tells of ancient examples of God sending the prophets and they were rejected, and he tells of a contemporary example of God sending a prophet who speaks against the king and against the city and against the land, and he is actually killed. And so Jesus says, look, you killed the prophets and you stoned them. Well, he's sounding like Jeremiah. Here's another example. Chapter 23, verse 38 of Matthew. Behold, your house is being left to you desolate. The house is going to be left desolate. So if the house here is in reference to the house of God, the temple, the second temple, then we could potentially have another connection with Jeremiah preaching against the house of God, Solomon's temple. So in Jeremiah chapter 12, verse 7, Yahweh says, I have forsaken my house. I have abandoned my inheritance. I have given the beloved of my soul into the hand of her enemies. Jeremiah chapter 12, verse 7. And then a few chapters later, in chapter 22, verse 5, it says, But if you will not obey these words, I swear by myself, declares Yahweh, that this house will become a desolation. Jeremiah 22, verse 5. So Jeremiah preaches the word of Yahweh that the temple will become desolate. And Jesus preaches the word of Yahweh saying, Behold, your house will be left for you desolate. I don't think that's an accident. I don't think that's a coincidence. I think Jesus is modeling his own preaching like the famous 6th century BC prophet Jeremiah. Both of them are preaching against the temple. Here's another example. Matthew 24, verse 2. And he, Jesus, said to the disciples, Do you not see all these things? Truly I say to you, not one stone here will be left upon another, which will not be torn down. Matthew 24, verse 2. So he's talking about the complete and utter destruction of the second temple. But Jeremiah preached the very same thing. Jeremiah chapter 9, verse 10. For the mountains, I, Yahweh, will take up a weeping and wailing, and for the pastures of the wilderness, a dirge, because they are laid waste so that no one passes through, and the lowing of the cattle is not heard. Both the birds of the sky and the beasts have fled, they are gone. I will make Jerusalem a heap of ruins, a haunt of jackals, and I will make the cities of Judah a desolation without inhabitant. That's Jeremiah chapter 9, verses 10 through 11, where Jeremiah preaches the complete destruction and desolation of Jerusalem. And then in Jeremiah 26, verse 6, Yahweh says, Then I will make this house like Shiloh, and this city I will make a curse to all the nations of the earth. So there is the destruction of the house of God in Jeremiah 26, verse 6. So again, I think Jesus is at least sounding like Jeremiah to those who are familiar with Jeremiah's message. And to me, I think the most obvious allusion is when Jesus talks about the new covenant at what we would call the Last Supper. So in Matthew 26, verse 26, it says, While they were eating, Jesus took some bread, and after a blessing, he broke it and gave it to the disciples and said, Take, eat, this is my body. And when he had taken a cup and given thanks, he gave it to them, saying, Drink from it, all of you, for this is my blood of the covenant, which is poured out for many for the forgiveness of sins. Matthew 26, verses 26 through 28. So here we can see that all the teaching of Jesus in the Gospel of Matthew, especially in the 5 blocks, are now being ratified with his blood, because that's how the Mosaic covenant was ratified. We had the teachings of Moses, and then they're ratified in blood, according to Exodus chapter 24, verse 8. And now we're having Jesus do the very same thing with the new covenant. But it's the blood of the covenant for the forgiveness of sins. And the only passage in the Old Testament that talks about the new covenant comes from, guess who? Jeremiah. It's Jeremiah 31, starting in verse 31. Behold, days are coming, declares Yahweh, when I will make a new covenant with the house of Israel and with the house of Judah, not like the covenant which I made with their fathers in the day I took them by the hand to bring them out of the land of Egypt, my covenant which they broke, although I was a husband to them, declares Yahweh. But this is the covenant which I will make with the house of Israel after those days, declares Yahweh. I'll put my law within them, and on their heart I will write it. And I will be their God, and they shall be my people. They will not teach again, each man his neighbor, and each man his brother, saying, Know Yahweh. For they will all know me, from the least of them to the greatest of them, declares Yahweh. For I will forgive their iniquity, and their sin I will remember no more. That's Jeremiah 31, verses 31 through 34. So Jeremiah prophesies about a new covenant. It's not the old covenant reinstituted. It's a brand new covenant. The old covenant was broken. And in this particular covenant, one of the major themes is that God is going to forgive their iniquity, and he's no longer going to remember their sins. And so Jesus talks about the new covenant in his blood for the forgiveness of sins. So that's a very clear connection to Jeremiah. So we have several places in which Matthew explicitly refers to Jeremiah, and we have several places, arguably, where Matthew is implicitly portraying Jesus in terms of Jeremiah's actions and also his words. So what does this mean? What does it mean for the Gospel of Matthew? Well, this brings me to my conclusions. Point number 4. I think that Matthew's interest in portraying Jesus in terms of the prophet Jeremiah can really be summarized into 4 points. The points are apologetic purposes, covenantal purposes, ecclesiological purposes, and of course, Christological purposes. So from the apologetic side, Matthew's Jewish Christian community needed some sort of assurance that their increasingly unpopular Jewish sect of Christ followers was not all for nothing. Having lived through the destruction of the Second Temple in 70 AD, which Jesus predicted in the Gospel of Matthew, gave proof to the original readers of Matthew that Jesus really was God's Messiah. He wasn't a fake Messiah. He wasn't a messianic pretender. He was the true Messiah. Just as Jeremiah's prediction that the first temple would be destroyed proved that Jeremiah was a true and legitimate prophet of Yahweh. So there's a very clear apologetics purpose in portraying Jesus as the new Jeremiah. The second purpose deals with the covenant. So Matthew's community of Christians was formed around Jesus' gospel of the kingdom, Jesus' kingdom teachings, and his sacrificial death, which helped solidify the community's self-identity as new covenant people. Now, when the temple was destroyed and the priesthood was displaced and all the sacrificial system was done away with, Matthew's community could rest assured that they had made the right choice in siding with Messiah Jesus and not with the Jewish leaders, particularly the Pharisees, that were left over from the violent resistance efforts in Jerusalem that led to the Jerusalem temple being destroyed. Jeremiah, the prophet, preached a new covenant that Jesus himself fulfilled with his covenant teachings, and his death sealed the new covenant agreement in his blood on the cross. So that's the covenantal aspect of it. The ecclesiological part, which deals with church matters, deals with Matthew's own church community, which saw itself in conflict with the Pharisees. And there is actually some evidence that these Matthean Christians experience some forms of persecution. You can see that if you read between the lines in the Gospel of Matthew. Now, by comparing Jesus to Jeremiah, the rejected and persecuted prophet at the hands of the children of Israel, these Christians in Matthew's church community would come to understand their own suffering in light of what Jeremiah went through personally. So Matthew's Christians are suffering at the hands of Jews. Jeremiah suffered at the hands of the children of Israel. So as these Christians suffered rejection from other Jews, they would look to Jeremiah, who was bold and continued to be faithful in the face of persecution and rejection of the Israelites of his own day, and they would find confidence in Jeremiah's example. And lastly, Christological, my favorite. So, some people regarded Jesus as a prophet like Jeremiah. Jesus looked like a prophet, he sounded like a prophet, he called himself a prophet. And what is a prophet? A prophet is just a human spokesperson who speaks on behalf of the only true God. So, by referring to Jesus as Jeremiah, or like one of the prophets, the people were not thinking that Jesus was the only true God. They didn't think that Jesus was going around claiming to be divine or claiming to be Yahweh. No, they said, this is a prophet. He does prophetic things. He talks like a prophet. He speaks like a prophet. In fact, he sounds very much like Jeremiah. They thought of him as a human prophet. And of course, Jesus says that he's much more than the prophet because he's also the Son of God. He is the Christ. But also, Jeremiah was not just an ordinary prophet. He was a primarily rejected prophet. And Jesus himself was also largely rejected within the Gospel of Matthew by his Jewish contemporaries. So like Jeremiah, Jesus was a prophet of doom, preaching judgment against the temple and against Jerusalem. And the Gospel of Matthew, I do think, deliberately portrays Jesus in ways that would recall the prophet Jeremiah, making Jesus the new Jeremiah. Thank you so much for listening to this week's episode. Please join us next week as we examine the different throne room images in both Testaments as they relate to the question of whether Jesus consciously pre-existed his birth alongside Yahweh in heaven. Please look forward to our next episode. If you enjoy our podcast, please consider supporting us as we aim to promote the sound truths about the oneness and unity of God and about the humanity of Jesus. You can support us absolutely for free by subscribing online, giving us an honest review, and reposting your favorite episodes so that your friends can see them. If you'd like to throw us a few dollars, you can check out the episode description for a PayPal link, or you can subscribe with one of the 2 membership options on the YouTube channel. The Biblical Unitarian Podcast is produced and edited by Dustin Williams. I am Dustin Smith, your host. Until next time, please take care.